Scary telling.
My heart was heavy with grief when my mother passed away. But before she left us, she bought me my first iPhone. It was a gift that I cherished, knowing that she wanted me to have the best technology. After she passed away, I kept the phone with me all the time. It was my connection to her, something that kept her memory alive. As time went on, I started noticing some strange things happening on my phone. I would randomly find Siri open with a small conversation on the screen. At first, I thought it was a glitch, but it happened a handful of times, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. One day, I was scared because I was starting my new job and left my phone on the desk next to me. Siri was open, and the screen said, "What you doing?" I burst into tears. "What you doing?" was the phrase my mom and I used to greet each other on the phone. I knew that this couldn't be a coincidence. Something was happening to my phone, and it had to do with my mother. I decided to dig deeper into the matter and did some research online. I stumbled upon an article about haunted phones, where the spirits of deceased loved ones use technology to communicate with the living. I was skeptical at first, but the more I read, the more convinced I became that my mother's spirit was trying to reach out to me through my iPhone. I tried to rationalize it, thinking that maybe someone else was accessing my phone remotely, but that didn't make sense. The only person who knew my passcode was me, and I had changed it multiple times since my mother's passing. One night, I decided to confront the spirit that was haunting my phone. I sat in my bedroom with the lights off, holding my iPhone tightly in my hand. I opened Siri and said, "Mom, are you here?" There was silence for a few seconds, and then I heard a faint voice coming from the speaker. It was my mother's voice. She said, "Yes, my child. I'm here." Tears streamed down my face as I talked to her through Siri. I asked her how she was doing, and she said she was happy and at peace. She told me that she loved me and that she was always watching over me. It was a bittersweet moment, and I felt a sense of comfort knowing that my mother's spirit was still with me. But then things took a dark turn. The conversations with my mother's spirit became more frequent, and the messages she sent me started to become sinister. She would say things like, "I'm always watching you," or "You can never escape me." I was terrified and didn't know what to do. I tried to turn off Siri and even reset my phone, but nothing worked. The spirit of my mother was too strong, and it seemed like it had a hold over my phone. I started having nightmares about my mother's spirit, and I couldn't sleep at night. I became paranoid, always thinking that someone was watching me. It was like my mother's spirit had become possessive and didn't want to let me go. One day, I decided to seek the help of a psychic medium. She listened to my story and told me that my mother's spirit was stuck in the world of the living and that it was using my phone as a conduit to communicate with me. She said that I needed to perform a spiritual cleansing to release my mother's spirit from my phone. I followed the medium's instructions and performed the cleansing ritual. When I opened my eyes, my phone was off and Siri was gone. I knew that my mother's spirit had finally been released from my phone, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But the relief was short-lived. That night, I heard strange noises coming from my phone. I picked it up, and to my horror, I saw Siri had opened again. The screen showed a message from my mother's spirit, saying, "I'm not going anywhere. You can't get rid of me that easily." I knew then that my mother's spirit was not going to let me go that easily. It had become too possessive, too attached to me, and it wasn't going to let me move on with my life. I realized that the only way to end the haunting was to give up the phone, the very thing that connected me to my mother. So, I made the tough decision to get rid of my iPhone. It was a difficult choice, but I knew that it was the only way to move on from the haunting. I bought a new phone and gave my old iPhone away. The haunting stopped, and I was finally able to sleep at night without worrying about my mother's spirit watching over me. But even now, years later, I still wonder if my mother's spirit is still out there, searching for a way to connect with me once again. It was supposed to be a fun visit to my brother's place, but what I experienced there still gives me goosebumps. They lived in a grand old Victorian house that had been in the family for generations. It had a certain charm to it, but there was also an eerie feeling that lingered in the air. One night, I was snuggled up with my 3-year-old niece in the playroom, watching TV on a futon. It was late, and everyone else in the house was asleep. We were watching cartoons, and my niece was nodding off, so I turned off the TV and tried to get her to go to sleep. But then something strange happened. The TV suddenly turned on, full blast, with a static screen. My niece jumped out of bed and ran to the TV, shutting it off. I was startled and asked her how she knew the TV would turn on. She shrugged and said, "They turn on every night at this time, before falling back asleep." I was baffled by what she said, and it sent chills down my spine. Who was they? What did she mean by every night at this time? I tried to brush it off and went to bed, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong in that house. The next morning, I asked my brother and his wife about the TV incident, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just a malfunction. But I knew it wasn't. There was something sinister lurking in that house, and I needed to find out what it was. That night, I stayed up late, sitting in the living room, waiting for something to happen. And it did. At exactly midnight, the TV turned on, full blast, with a static screen. I froze in terror, and then I heard a faint whisper coming from the TV. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but I knew it was a voice that didn't belong to anyone in the house. I tried to turn off the TV, but it wouldn't budge. The remote wasn't working, and the power button on the TV was jammed. I was trapped in a nightmare, and I didn't know what to do. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room. It was hazy, almost like a shadow, but I could make out its shape. It was tall and had long, slender arms. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its malevolent presence. I was paralyzed with fear, but then I remembered my niece's words. They turn on every night at this time. That meant there was more than one entity in that house. I had to do something before it was too late. I mustered up all the courage I had and ran upstairs to my brother's room. I woke him up and told him what had happened. At first, he didn't believe me, but then he saw the fear in my eyes and knew that something was wrong. We went back downstairs, armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat. The figure was still there, but this time it was closer. We could see it more clearly now, and it was horrifying. Its eyes were black pits, and its fingers were long and bony. My brother swung the bat at the figure, but it passed right through it. It was like hitting air. We were no match for whatever was in that house, and we knew it. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, huddled together, waiting for morning to come. When the sun finally rose, we left the house, never to return. I never found out what happened in that house, but I knew that it was haunted by something evil. The memory of that night stayed with me for a long time, and I couldn't help but feel a chill down my spine whenever I thought about it. Years later, I learned that the house had a dark history. It was built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family who had lost their fortune during the Great Depression. They were forced to sell the house to a man who was rumored to be involved in the occult. The man disappeared mysteriously, and the house was left vacant for years. Locals said that strange things happened in the house, and people who entered never returned. My brother and his family moved out of the house shortly after our visit, and it remained empty for years. Until one day, it was bought by a family who was unaware of its dark past. They experienced similar hauntings and were forced to move out. The house still stands today, vacant and foreboding. People say that the spirits of the previous occupants still roam its halls, and anyone who enters is never seen again. The haunting of the Victorian house continues, and it's a reminder that sometimes the past never truly leaves us. When my son was just a few months old, I loved to spend hours bouncing him on my knee, making him giggle and laugh. I would count as I bounced him, 1, 2, 3, and he would burst into laughter at 3. It was such a joy to hear his little voice fill the room. One day, I decided to record his laughter on my phone so I could listen to it whenever I wanted. I got my son ready and started bouncing him, counting as usual. 1, 2, 3, and he laughed out loud. But as I listened back to the recording, I heard something that made my blood run cold. After I said 3, I could clearly hear a man's voice saying 4. The voice was deep and gravelly, and it didn't sound like anyone I knew. I replayed the recording over and over, trying to find a logical explanation, but I couldn't. I showed the recording to my husband, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably some kind of glitch. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of my son crying. I went to check on him, but he was fast asleep, so I assumed it was just a bad dream. But when I went back to bed, I heard something that made me freeze in fear. I heard the same deep, gravelly voice whispering in my ear, 4. I turned on the lights and searched the house, but I couldn't find anyone. I was convinced that something was wrong, but my husband dismissed it as my imagination. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening around the house. I would hear footsteps in the hallway, even though no one was there. Objects would move on their own, and I would find my son's toys scattered around the room, even though no one had been playing with them. But the scariest thing happened one night while I was alone with my son. I was feeding him his bottle, and he was staring at something behind me, his eyes wide with fear. I turned around to see what he was looking at, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its eyes on me. I froze, not knowing what to do. My son's cries snapped me out of my trance, and I ran to grab him, but the figure was gone by the time I turned back around. I knew then that we were dealing with something more than just a glitch in my phone. I started doing research and found out that our house was built on an ancient burial ground. I knew then that we had to leave. But the spirit wasn't going to let us go that easily. It started to manifest more and more, appearing as a dark figure in the corner of my eye, whispering in my ear at night, and moving objects around the house. One night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed my son and left the house, determined to find a way to get rid of the spirit once and for all. I went to a local spiritualist, who gave me a recipe for a cleansing ritual. I followed the ritual to the letter, and when I returned home, the house was silent. No more footsteps in the hallway, no more objects moving on their own. The spirit had finally left us alone. But the memory of that terrifying time still haunts me to this day. Every time I count to 3, I can't help but wonder if the voice that comes after will be the voice of that evil spirit, reminding me of the 4th bounce. I used to think my paper route was mundane, but that all changed when I met Margie. Margie was an old lady who lived alone in a small house at the end of our delivery route. Since she was a regular customer, we'd always stop and check on her to make sure she was okay. One day, I went inside her house to deliver the paper and check on her. As usual, Margie was asleep on the bed, so I left the paper on the table and quietly left the room. The next day, I found her in the same position, still asleep, with yesterday's paper still unopened. I thought it was strange, but I just assumed she was a deep sleeper. The following day, I went inside her house again, and to my surprise, Margie was awake. She seemed very happy and hugged me tightly, thanking me for checking on her. I could feel her frail body shaking with joy, and I was happy to see her awake and alert. But the next morning, when I went back to her house, something was different. There were cars parked outside, and when I went inside, I saw a few people gathered around Margie's bed. That's when I found out that Margie had passed away 3 or 4 days before. My heart sank as I realized that I had spoken to and hugged Margie 24 hours after she had died. I was horrified and couldn't understand how that was possible. Had I imagined the entire interaction with her? Had I hugged a dead body? As the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started having nightmares about Margie, and I could hear her voice calling out to me in the middle of the night. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling of unease persisted. One night, I decided to go back to Margie's house to try and find some answers. I walked up to her front door and could see a faint light coming from inside. I cautiously stepped inside and immediately felt a chill run down my spine. The room was eerily silent, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. As I walked towards the bedroom, I could hear faint whispers and footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I quickened my pace and reached the bedroom, only to find it empty. But then I heard a voice that I recognized all too well, whisper my name. I turned around, and there she was, Margie, standing right in front of me. Her skin was pale, and her eyes were sunken, but she was alive, or so it seemed. She beckoned me to come closer, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. But as I got closer, Margie's face contorted into a twisted grin, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. I stumbled backwards, and when I looked up again, Margie was gone. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back to Margie's house. I quit my paper route, and I moved away from that town as soon as I could. But even now, years later, I can still hear Margie's voice in my dreams, calling out to me, taunting me, reminding me that I hugged a dead woman. I always heard stories of duendes growing up, but I never thought I'd encounter one. My grandma's brother-in-law, Tio Carlos, had one traveling with him. They said he befriended the duende by leaving offerings of food and wine every night before he went to sleep. It brought him good luck in his gambling habits, and he was always bragging about his winnings. One day, my grandma asked me to go with her to visit Tio Carlos. When we arrived, I noticed he looked frail and sickly. His skin was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. My grandma went to talk to him while I looked around the house. As I wandered through the rooms, I heard whispers in the corners, but when I turned, there was no one there. I dismissed it as my imagination and went back to the living room. Tio Carlos and my grandma were talking, and he looked at me with a sad expression. He told me that the duende he had befriended was no longer with him. Something had happened to upset it, and it left him with a curse. The doctors couldn't find the cause of his illness, and he knew deep down it was the duende's doing. He said that he had tried to apologize, but it was too late. The room suddenly grew cold, and I heard a rustling behind me. I turned around to see a small figure in the corner. It was a duende. It stared at me with its glowing red eyes, and I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, I was paralyzed. The duende started to speak in a language I couldn't understand, and its voice was like nails on a chalkboard. It told me that Tio Carlos had angered it by not leaving offerings for 2 nights in a row. It said it would forgive him if he apologized and left an offering of wine and bread, but it was too late. The curse had been cast. Suddenly, the room was filled with a bright light, and I heard a loud screeching noise. I blacked out, and when I woke up, I was alone in the room. Tio Carlos had passed away in his sleep, and the duende was gone. My grandma said that it was just my imagination, but I knew what I saw was real. I could feel the weight of the duende's curse on me, and I knew I had to do something to break it. I researched everything I could about duendes and their curses, but I couldn't find anything. One day, I went to a faith healer, and he told me that the only way to break the curse was to leave an offering of wine and bread at the spot where Tio Carlos had last left his. I went to the house, and when I arrived, I saw the duende in the corner of the room. It was waiting for me. I left the offering and apologized, and the duende vanished. I could feel the weight of the curse lifted, and I knew that Tio Carlos was finally at peace. But I always wonder if the duende is still out there, waiting to cast its curse on the next person who upsets it.